Welcome, dear listeners, to another tale of shadowed secrets and fatal deception. Tonight's mystery unfolds beneath the looming presence of the Blackwood Clocktower, a place where time rules all, and yet one deadly moment refuses to be forgotten. When a respected figure is found dead at the base of the ancient tower, the quiet town of Blackwood is shaken to its core. Whispers spread, alibis crack, and every chime of the clock seems to accuse someone new. Hercule Poirot arrives to uncover the truth hidden beneath poisoned words, broken timelines, and carefully measured lies. Settle in, relax, and engage your little grey cells. Because at Blackwood Clocktower, time itself may be the killer. Chapter 1. The Clock That Never Sleeps. The Blackwood Clocktower had never slept. For more than a century, it had stood at the heart of the town like a stone guardian, its iron hands circling endlessly, its chimes dictating the rhythm of daily life. People in Blackwood trusted the clock more than they trusted one another. Shops opened by it, trains were caught by it, funerals were timed to its solemn toll. And on this particular winter morning, the clock tower marked something else entirely: death. The discovery came just before dawn, when the town was still wrapped in mist and half-formed dreams. A milkman named Arthur Bell, following the same route he had followed for 23 years, slowed his cart near the square to adjust a loose crate. As he did so, his lantern light caught something dark at the base of the tower, something that did not belong. At first he thought it was rubbish, then a fallen coat. Then, as he stepped closer, the truth settled heavily into his chest. A man lay motionless on the cold stone, one arm bent unnaturally beneath him, his hat fallen several feet away. His face, pale and strangely peaceful, was turned toward the tower, as though he had been watching the clock when life left him. Arthur Bell screamed. Within minutes, doors opened along the square, windows rattled upward. Blackwood, a town that thrived on routine and predictability, found itself abruptly awake. By the time the local constable arrived, the fog had thickened, curling around the clock tower's base like a shroud. A small crowd gathered at a cautious distance, whispering in frightened clusters. No one touched the body. Everyone knew whose it was. Dr. Edwin Hawthorne, respected physician, wealthy landowner, a man whose opinion carried weight in every civic decision Blackwood had made for the last 15 years. He had delivered half the town's children into the world and certified the deaths of the other half's grandparents. And now he lay dead beneath the very clock that ruled the town. The clock face above showed 3:17. No one could say whether it had stopped at that moment or whether it had been stopped deliberately. Inspector James Japp arrived shortly after sunrise, stamping his boots against the cold as he surveyed the square. He frowned at the frozen hands, the lack of blood, the unnatural stillness of the body. "This doesn't look like a fall," he muttered. "It is not." The voice came from behind him, calm, precise, unmistakably Belgian. Hercule Poirot stepped forward, his coat buttoned neatly despite the chill, his moustache immaculate as ever. He paused just short of the body, tilting his head slightly, his sharp eyes absorbing every detail. "Poirot!" Japp said, surprised. "You weren't expected." Poirot smiled politely. "Ah, but death does not send invitations, Inspector. It simply announces itself." Poirot's gaze moved methodically from the body to the stone base of the tower, to the faint scuff marks nearby, and finally upward to the silent clock. "Tell me," Poirot said softly, "did anyone hear the chime?" Japp shook his head. "No reports. Most of the town was asleep." Poirot nodded. "Then already we have something curious." He crouched slightly, not to touch the body, but to observe. Dr. Hawthorne's clothes were immaculate, no torn fabric, no sign of struggle. His face bore no expression of terror, only surprise, as though death had arrived politely without warning. Poirot straightened. "He did not die here," Poirot said. Japp raised an eyebrow. "You're sure?" "Oui," Poirot replied. "A fall would bruise. A struggle would leave marks. This man simply stopped." Poirot inhaled slowly, then frowned. "And there is a scent." Japp leaned closer. "I smell nothing." Poirot smiled faintly. "That is because you are not looking for it." Poirot gestured gently. "A faint bitterness, chemical, almost sweet, not natural." Japp sighed. "Poison." Poirot nodded. "Yes, poison." The word passed through the gathered crowd like a chill. Whispers grew louder. "Who would poison Dr. Hawthorne?" "He was a good man. He saved my boy." Poirot turned, studying the faces. Shock, fear, calculation, relief. Relief always interested him most. "Inspector," Poirot said, "tell me about his last night." Japp consulted his notebook. Dinner at the Blackwood Assembly Hall, town council meeting. He left around 10. Several witnesses. Poirot nodded. "And after?" "No one saw him." Poirot's moustache twitched. "So, between 10 o'clock and 3:17, something happened." Poirot stepped back, letting his eyes trace the tower again. The clock loomed overhead, massive gears hidden within stone walls, thick with history. "A place obsessed with time," Poirot murmured. "How appropriate." As the body was carefully covered, Poirot noticed something else, small, easily overlooked, a faint discoloration near Dr. Hawthorne's lips. Almost imperceptible, Poirot's eyes sharpened. "Inspector," he said quietly, "was Dr. Hawthorne known to drink?" Japp frowned. "A glass of brandy in the evenings, nothing excessive." Poirot nodded. "And where would he drink?" Japp hesitated. "His office, or the assembly hall?" Poirot turned toward the hall, a stately building facing the square. "Then our murder scene," Poirot said softly, "is elsewhere." As constables moved the body away, the town seemed to shrink inward, as though Blackwood itself felt exposed. Doors closed, curtains fell, silence settled uneasily. Poirot walked slowly around the base of the tower. He studied the stonework, the narrow service door leading inside, and the faint marks where something heavy had been dragged, carefully, deliberately. "He was placed here," Poirot said. "Not dropped. Placed." Japp exhaled sharply. "To make it look dramatic." "To make it symbolic," Poirot corrected. "The clock tower is authority, order, control." Poirot looked up again at the frozen hands. "Someone wished his death to be timed," Poirot said. "Timed how?" Japp asked. Poirot smiled thinly. "That, Inspector, is what we must discover." As the clock tower loomed over them, one thing became painfully clear to Poirot. This was not merely a murder. It was a message, and somewhere in Blackwood, someone believed they had calculated everything perfectly. The poison, the placement, and the precise moment time would stop. But Poirot knew better. Time always betrayed the killer. Chapter 2. The hour before midnight, Blackwood did not take kindly to disruption. By mid-morning, the town square had returned to a fragile imitation of normality. Shops opened cautiously, voices stayed low, yet every glance drifted sooner or later toward the looming clock tower, its hands still frozen at 3:17, as if time itself refused to move on. Hercule Poirot walked slowly along the cobblestones, his cane tapping gently, his eyes alert to every detail the town tried to hide. He disliked small towns. They pretended to simplicity, but in truth they were intricate machines, each resident a gear, each secret a spring under tension. Inspector Japp joined him near the entrance of the Blackwood Assembly Hall, a stately brick building that overlooked the square. "This is where Hawthorne had dinner last night," Japp said. "Town council gathering, about 20 people." Poirot nodded. "Then this is where death began, even if it finished elsewhere." Inside, the hall smelled faintly of polish and old paper. Chairs were arranged neatly, as though discipline might ward off tragedy. A long dining table occupied the center of the room, still bearing the ghost of last night's gathering. Water glasses set aside, crumbs swept, but not entirely erased. Poirot paused beside the head of the table. "Dr. Hawthorne sat here," Japp said. Poirot studied the chair. "A position of authority, convenient for conversation and observation." Japp snorted. "You see danger in a dinner chair now," Poirot smiled. "I see opportunity." They began the slow process of reconstruction. According to statements, dinner had begun shortly after 8. Conversation was polite but tense. A controversial proposal had been discussed. Dr. Hawthorne's recommendation to close the old clock tower maintenance fund and redirect money elsewhere. "That decision upset people," Japp said. "The tower is practically sacred here." Poirot's moustache twitched. "Sacred things often inspire dangerous devotion." One by one, the dinner guests were brought in to speak. Mrs. Eleanor Pike, town secretary, spoke first. "He was firm," she said, "unyielding, said the tower no longer required extensive funding." "And your opinion?" Poirot asked gently. I disagreed, she replied stiffly. The clock tower is Blackwood, Poirot nodded. But disagreement is not poison. Next came Mr. Harold Finch, chairman of the council, a nervous man who wiped his brow constantly. Hawthorne embarrassed me, Finch said bitterly. Corrected me in front of everyone. Japp leaned forward. You angry enough to kill him? Finch recoiled. Of course not. Poirot watched closely. Finch's anger was loud, unguarded, inelegant, not the kind that brewed poison. Then came Miss Lydia Crane, the clock tower's official caretaker. She was younger than Poirot expected, her expression guarded, her hands clasped tightly. I maintain the mechanism, she said. Dr. Hawthorne wanted to reduce inspections. Poirot tilted his head. You opposed this? Yes, she admitted. The tower is fragile. Poirot noted the word choice. Fragile things required care or manipulation. And after dinner? Poirot asked. Dr. Hawthorne left early, Lydia said. Around 10. Poirot's eyes sharpened. Alone? She hesitated. Yes. One lie, Poirot thought, could hide inside a hesitation. As statements continued, a pattern emerged. Everyone had reason to resent Dr. Hawthorne. No one had reason to mourn him deeply. Poirot returned to the table, studying the remaining glasses. He leaned closer to one, sniffed subtly. Inspector, Poirot murmured. Which glass did Dr. Hawthorne use? Japp pointed. That one, nearest the head. Poirot examined it carefully. A faint film clung to the inside, almost invisible. Wine? Japp asked. No, Poirot said. Something else was added. Not enough to kill. Not yet. Japp frowned. You think he was poisoned here? Partially, Poirot replied. A delayed poison, something to weaken, something to prepare. Japp cursed under his breath. So the clock tower was the second act? Precisely, Poirot straightened. Now tell me, who had access to these glasses after dinner? Japp hesitated. Staff, council members, anyone still here? Poirot smiled thinly. And who stayed behind? Japp checked his notes. Miss Crane, she locked up. Poirot's gaze drifted toward the window where the clock tower loomed. Timekeeper, Poirot murmured. Caretaker, guardian, Japp folded his arms. You, suspector, Poirot shook his head. I suspect access. They left the hall and crossed the square toward the clock tower itself. The service door at its base was unlocked now, guarded by a constable. Inside, the tower smelled of oil and ancient stone. Narrow stairs spiraled upward, disappearing into shadow. Above them, unseen gears waited in silence. Poirot placed a hand on the wall. Inspector, he said softly, this tower does not merely tell time, it keeps it. They ascended slowly. At the first platform, Poirot stopped abruptly. What is this? He asked. Japp frowned. Maintenance landing. Poirot pointed to a small table, barely noticeable, holding a cup, long since empty. A man weakened by poison, Poirot said, climbs these stairs. He stops. He rests. He drinks. Japp's eyes widened. Someone left a drink here, Poirot nodded. And someone knew he would need it. They continued upward until they reached the mechanism room. Massive gears loomed overhead, frozen mid-motion. A faint chemical smell lingered. Poirot inhaled slowly. The final dose, he said, administered here. Japp stared at the gears. So Hawthorne came up here, poisoned, and died. And then, Poirot added, he was carried down and placed at the base. Japp shook his head. That takes strength. Poirot smiled grimly. Or assistance? Poirot knelt and examined the floor. Faint scuff marks, drag marks. Two distinct shoe patterns. One pair belongs to Hawthorne, Poirot said. The other does not. Japp exhaled. So he wasn't alone. Poirot stood slowly. The killer planned this carefully, Poirot said. Dinner to weaken him, the tower to finish him, time to provide the alibi. And everyone was asleep by 3, Japp said. Poirot nodded. Or pretended to be. As they descended, Poirot glanced once more at the frozen clock face through a narrow window. Inspector, he said quietly, Who controls the clock, controls the truth. The tower loomed behind them as they stepped back into the square, and somewhere in Blackwood, the killer was already adjusting their story, counting on the town's love of routine to protect them. But Poirot knew one thing for certain: the hour before midnight always told the truth. Chapter 3, The Keeper of Time. Blackwood had always trusted its clock tower. Long before the town council existed, before the assembly hall had brick walls and polished floors, the clock tower had ruled the square with impartial authority. It did not care who was rich or poor, liked or feared. It simply counted the hours and demanded obedience, and the person who knew it best was Lydia Crane. Hercule Poirot stood at the base of the tower once more, studying the narrow service door as though it might speak if asked the right question. Inspector Japp waited beside him, arms folded, his patience thinning. "You really think the caretaker is our key?" Japp asked. Poirot did not answer immediately. He ran a gloved finger lightly along the stone near the door frame, feeling for irregularities. "I think," Poirot said at last, "that anyone who controls access controls opportunity." The door creaked softly as they entered. The interior smelled of oil, dust, and cold iron. An honest smell, Poirot thought. A place built to function, not to impress. The spiral staircase rose sharply, hugging the inner wall like a coiled spine. They climbed. Each step echoed with hollow finality. Poirot counted them automatically, noting where the sound changed, where stone gave way to wood, where repairs had been made long after the original construction. At the first landing, Lydia Crane waited. She stood stiffly, hands clasped in front of her, eyes alert but guarded. She wore a heavy wool coat, practical boots, and no jewelry beyond a simple watch on her wrist. "You wish to see me," she said. Poirot inclined his head. "Merci, mademoiselle. You maintain the tower?" "Yes," Lydia replied. "I inspect the mechanism twice daily." Poirot's eyes flicked to her watch. A precise woman. "One must be," she said coolly. "Time does not forgive carelessness." Poirot smiled faintly. "Tell me," Poirot said gently, "when did you last see Dr. Hawthorne?" Lydia hesitated. "At the assembly hall, during dinner." "And after?" Poirot pressed. She inhaled. "I saw him enter the square later that night," Japp snapped. "You said earlier you didn't." Lydia's jaw tightened. "I remembered afterward." Poirot noted the tension, not guilt, but control. Lydia chose her words carefully, like someone accustomed to managing fragile systems. "What time?" Poirot asked. "Just before 11, Lydia replied. "He was walking toward the tower." Poirot nodded. "Alone?" "Yes." Poirot turned slightly, gesturing toward the staircase. "And did you follow him?" "No," Lydia said quickly. "I had already locked the lower doors." Poirot raised an eyebrow. "Already?" "Yes," she repeated. "Routine." Poirot smiled politely, but inside his little grey cells stirred. Routines were useful but also dangerous. They created predictability. "May we continue upward?" Poirot asked. Lydia hesitated, then nodded. As they climbed, Poirot spoke casually. "You disagreed with Dr. Hawthorne about funding." "Yes." "You were angry?" "Yes." "But anger alone does not create poison," Poirot said softly. They reached the mechanism room. The massive gears loomed above them, frozen like beasts mid-motion. Poirot stepped forward, examining the metal teeth, the oil residue, the wooden platform beneath. "You stopped the clock," Poirot said. Lydia stiffened. "Yes, for inspection." "At 3:17, Japp demanded. Lydia looked down. "Yes." Poirot tilted his head. "How fortunate." She met his gaze sharply. "The mechanism was making noise." Poirot nodded. "And so you stopped time." Poirot walked slowly around the platform. He noticed a folded cloth tucked beneath a beam. A maintenance rag, stained but not with oil, something darker. Poirot crouched, not touching it. "Inspector," he said quietly, "this cloth was used recently." Japp leaned closer. "Blood?" "No," Poirot replied. "Something else. Poison residue, perhaps." Lydia's breath quickened. Poirot straightened. "Mademoiselle Crane, did Dr. Hawthorne drink anything while here?" She swallowed. "I offered him water." Poirot nodded. "From where?" She pointed toward a small shelf. An empty cup rested there. Poirot smiled sadly. And you did not drink from it yourself? No. Poirot folded his hands. You are very careful, mademoiselle. You know that poisons leave traces. Japp stepped forward. You poisoned him. Lydia shook her head fiercely. No, I did not kill him. Poirot raised a hand. Inspector, patience. Poirot turned back to Lydia. You offered him water. Why? He looked unwell, she said. He was pale, sweating. Poirot nodded. Because he had already been poisoned. Lydia's eyes widened. Poirot continued gently. You did not kill him, but you helped him. Silence fell. Poirot gestured to the staircase. After he collapsed, you called for help? No, Lydia whispered. Poirot closed his eyes briefly. You panicked. Yes, she sobbed. I thought he would accuse me. He had threatened my job, said I was sentimental, that the tower was just stone. Poirot's voice softened. So you moved the body, Lydia nodded. I dragged him down. I wanted it to look like fate. Japp swore quietly. You tampered with the scene. Yes, Lydia cried, but I did not poison him, I swear it. Poirot believed her. He turned to Japp. She is our misdirection. Japp frowned. Meaning? Poirot looked back at Lydia. Someone knew she would panic. Someone counted on her to move the body, to freeze the clock, to corrupt the scene. Lydia stared at him in horror. You're saying I was used, Poirot nodded. We. Poirot's eyes sharpened. Tell me, who knew your routine? Lydia hesitated. The counsel, Dr. Hawthorne, and… She stopped. And who? Poirot pressed. Mr. Harold Finch. Japp's head snapped up. The council chairman? Lydia nodded. He oversees maintenance funding. He comes here often. Poirot's moustache twitched. Finch, nervous, overlooked, always present. Poirot turned toward the window, looking down at the square below. The frozen clock face loomed. The killer, Poirot said softly, did not poison Dr. Hawthorne here. They ensured he would finish dying here. Poirot turned back to Lydia. You are guilty of fear, mademoiselle, not murder. Lydia sank onto the bench, trembling. As they descended, Japp muttered, So Finch is our man. Poirot shook his head slowly. No, Finch is a piece. Japp frowned. Then who's left? Poirot smiled thinly. Someone who understands people better than machines. They reached the bottom of the tower. Outside, the square looked unchanged, but Poirot knew better. The case had turned, the tower had spoken, and its keeper had revealed the truth, not of murder, but of manipulation. Chapter 4, Poisoned Words. By late afternoon, Blackwood had begun to look like itself again, at least on the surface. Shopkeepers returned to their counters, carts rattled across the square, and polite greetings resumed. Yet beneath the routine something had shifted. Conversations lowered when strangers passed. Doors closed more firmly than usual. The clock tower, still frozen at 3:17, loomed like an accusation no one dared address. Hercule Poirot sat quietly at a corner table inside the Blackwood Assembly Hall, nursing a cup of tea he had not touched. Inspector Japp stood near the window, watching townspeople drift past. So, Japp said, breaking the silence, the caretaker didn't poison him. She only moved the body. Yes, Poirot replied calmly. Fear makes people foolish, but fear alone does not calculate poison. Japp exhaled. Which leaves us with a problem. Our crime scene is compromised. Poirot smiled faintly. Non, it is merely rearranged. Poirot rose and walked slowly around the hall, stopping near the long dining table where the council had gathered the night before. The surface had been cleaned, but Poirot's eyes searched not for dirt, but for memory. Words, Poirot said softly. This murder began with words. Japp frowned. You mean the argument about funding? Among other things, Poirot replied. Dr. Hawthorne was not merely a physician, he was a gatekeeper of money, of influence, of secrets. Poirot tapped the table gently. Who spoke last at dinner? Japp checked his notes. Mr. Harold Finch, council chairman. Poirot nodded. And what did he say? That Hawthorne was out of touch, that he underestimated the town's attachment to the tower. Poirot's moustache twitched. A public challenge. Poirot gestured toward the chairs. People rarely forgive humiliation, Inspector, especially not quiet men. Japp frowned. Finch doesn't strike me as a killer. He's nervous, disorganized. Poirot smiled. Exactly. Poirot moved toward the sideboard where glasses had been set the previous evening. He crouched slightly, examining the cabinet beneath. Inspector, Poirot said, who served the drinks? Staff from the hall, Japp replied. But council members helped themselves. Poirot nodded. And Dr. Hawthorne trusted them. Poirot straightened. Let us speak to Finch again. They found Harold Finch in his office behind the hall, small, cramped, lined with files stacked too high. Finch looked up sharply as they entered, his hands already shaking. Inspector, Monsieur Poirot, he said quickly, have you resolved matters? Poirot smiled politely. We are progressing, Finch swallowed. Good, good. Poirot sat opposite him, folding his hands. Tell me, Monsieur Finch, how long have you known Dr. Hawthorne? Years, Finch replied, since before I became chairman. And you trusted him? Finch laughed weakly. Trusted? I feared him. Poirot tilted his head. Why? He controlled the purse, Finch said. Funding, grants, donations. He made or broke projects. Poirot nodded. Including the clock tower. Yes, Finch said sharply. He wanted to abandon it. Poirot leaned forward slightly. And you disagreed? Finch wiped his brow. I did. Strongly, Poirot pressed. Finch hesitated. Yes. Poirot smiled gently. Strong disagreement often leads to strong language. Finch's face flushed. We argued, that is all. Poirot nodded. What did you drink that evening? Wine, Finch said. 1 glass. And Dr. Hawthorne? The same. Poirot's eyes sharpened. Did you pour it? Finch blinked. I don't remember. Poirot rose. Memory is selective. Poirot turned toward Finch's desk. There, neatly arranged, sat a small medicine bottle, empty. Poirot pointed to it calmly. May I? Finch stiffened. That's for my heart. Poirot nodded. Prescribed? Yes. Poirot lifted the bottle slightly, examining it without opening. You refill it often? Finch's voice wavered. As needed. Poirot smiled faintly. Did you know Dr. Hawthorne was investigating irregular prescriptions? Finch froze. Japp stepped forward. What irregular prescriptions? Poirot answered instead. Small experimental compounds, not yet illegal, but questionable. Finch's breath quickened. That's ridiculous. Poirot leaned in. Dr. Hawthorne was a doctor. He noticed patterns, purchases, dosages. Finch stood abruptly. I did not poison him. Poirot raised a hand. I did not say you did. Poirot paused, then spoke softly. But you knew he was unwell that evening. Finch's shoulders slumped. He looked pale. Poirot nodded. Because he had already been weakened. Poirot straightened. Someone gave him the first dose at dinner. Enough to ensure he would seek air, solitude, the tower. Finch shook his head. You're saying I set him up. Poirot's gaze was steady. I am saying you may have unknowingly assisted. Finch collapsed into his chair. I argued with him. I poured the wine, that's all. Poirot believed him, mostly. Outside, the clock tower chimed silently, its frozen hands a constant reminder. Poirot returned to the square with Japp. So, Finch isn't the killer, Japp muttered, but he's part of the chain. Poirot nodded. Chains are built link by link. Poirot stopped suddenly. Inspector, who benefits most from Dr. Hawthorne's silence? Japp frowned. Several people. Poirot smiled. Who benefits quietly? Japp's eyes widened slightly. Mrs. Pike. Poirot nodded. The secretary. They turned toward the council offices. Eleanor Pike greeted them with a composed smile. Too composed. Her desk was immaculate, her posture perfect. Monsieur Poirot, she said calmly, have you made progress? Poirot smiled back. Indeed. Poirot walked slowly around the room. You handled the council's correspondence. Yes. Funding requests. Yes. Medical reimbursements, Poirot added softly. Her smile tightened. Poirot continued. You knew Dr. Hawthorne's habits, his concerns. His investigations? Mrs. Pike folded her hands. I assisted him, Poirot nodded. And you resented him, her eyes flashed. He underestimated me. Poirot's voice softened. Did you provide him something to drink after dinner? Silence. Poirot leaned closer. A cordial, a tea, something kind. Mrs. Pike swallowed. He asked for water, Poirot nodded. And you gave it. Japp stepped forward. You poisoned it. Mrs. Pike shook her head slowly. Not to kill him. Poirot's eyes sharpened. To weaken him. She exhaled. He threatened to expose my arrangements, my access to experimental supplies. Poirot nodded. So you ensured he would go to the tower alone, unwell. Mrs. Pike's composure cracked. I did not know someone would finish it. Poirot closed his eyes briefly. Now the shape of the crime was clear. 2 hands, 1 poison, 1 placement. Poirot turned to Japp. Inspector, our killer did not work alone. Japp exhaled. A conspiracy. Poirot nodded. But conspiracies break. As Poirot stepped back into the square, he looked once more at the clock tower. The poison, he murmured, was only the beginning. And somewhere in Blackwood, the true architect of the crime felt the pressure rising, because Poirot was now counting people, not minutes. Chapter 5. The Hand Behind the Hour. By evening, Blackwood felt like a town holding its breath. The fog returned as the sun dipped behind the rooftops, creeping back into the square and curling lovingly around the base of the clock tower. Lamps were lit earlier than usual, their yellow glow unable to dispel the unease that had settled into every corner of the town. Hercule Poirot stood beneath the tower once more, his hands clasped behind his back, his gaze fixed on the frozen clock face. 3:17, a time chosen, not accidental. Inspector Japp joined him, rubbing his temples. So let me get this straight, he said. The secretary weakens him. The caretaker panics and moves the body. Finch pours the wine without knowing, and the doctor, Hawthorne, ends up dead beneath this thing. Poirot nodded slowly. Yes, Japp frowned. That's a lot of, people involved for one murder. Poirot smiled faintly. That is because not all involvement is guilt. Poirot tapped his cane gently against the stone. Only one person needed Dr. Hawthorne dead. The others needed him quiet. Japp glanced up at the tower. You're saying someone orchestrated it? Oui, Poirot replied. Like a conductor guiding an orchestra, each instrument playing its part, unaware of the full melody. They walked toward the assembly hall, where Poirot had requested all key figures to gather later that night. The message had been phrased carefully, not as an accusation, but as a clarification of facts. Inside, Poirot prepared his stage. He arranged chairs in a semicircle facing the clock tower, facing windows. He asked that the lights remain low. He requested tea, nothing stronger. Poirot liked minds clear and tongues loose. One by one they arrived. Harold Finch entered first, pale and jittery, hands clasping his hat. Eleanor Pike followed, composed but tight-lipped. Lydia Crane slipped in quietly, eyes lowered, burdened by guilt. Several council members took seats along the wall, observers, not players. Poirot remained standing. Thank you for coming, he said calmly. This will not take long. Japp leaned against the wall, arms folded, watching closely. Poirot began not with accusations, but with truth. Dr. Hawthorne was poisoned in stages, Poirot said. A weakening dose at dinner, a fatal dose later. A murmur rippled through the room. Poirot raised a hand. But the fatal dose was not given by everyone. He turned to Lydia Crane. You moved the body, Lydia nodded, tears in her eyes. Yes. Poirot turned to Eleanor Pike. You gave him water. Eleanor's chin lifted. Yes, to calm him. Poirot nodded. To weaken him. Eleanor flinched but said nothing. Poirot turned to Finch. You poured the wine. Finch swallowed. Yes, Poirot smiled gently. None of you intended to kill him. The room fell silent. Poirot let that sink in. And yet, he continued, Dr. Hawthorne is dead. Poirot began to pace slowly. Which means, he said, That one person here understood exactly how these actions would combine. Poirot stopped behind Finch. You were frightened of Hawthorne, but you are not cruel. He moved to Eleanor. You resented Hawthorne, but you wanted him silenced, not buried. He turned to Lydia. You panicked, but panic is not murder. Poirot finally stopped near the window, the clock tower visible behind him like a silent judge. The mastermind, Poirot said softly, is someone who understood people better than poison. Japp's eyes narrowed. Poirot continued. Someone who knew Finch would pour the wine, who knew Eleanor would provide water, who knew Lydia would freeze the clock and move the body. Poirot turned slowly, and someone who knew the town would accept it. A chair creaked. All eyes shifted to the far end of the room. There, sitting quietly, almost forgotten, was Councillor Thomas Bellamy. He had arrived unnoticed. He often did. Bellamy was older than the others, his hair grey, his posture relaxed. He had spoken little during the investigation. When he did, it was always reasonable, calming. Mr. Bellamy, Poirot said gently, you have been very quiet. Bellamy smiled mildly. I see no reason to speak unless spoken to. Poirot nodded. A wise philosophy. You supported the funding cut, yes? Bellamy shrugged. The tower drains resources. And yet, Poirot said, you opposed Hawthorne privately. Bellamy's smile faltered slightly. We disagreed. Poirot leaned forward. You disagreed because Hawthorne was about to uncover something. Was he not? Bellamy's eyes hardened. You speculate. Poirot shook his head. I deduce, Poirot continued. You knew Eleanor had access to supplies. You knew Finch would be humiliated. You knew Lydia's devotion to the tower. Poirot's voice sharpened. And you knew Hawthorne would go to the tower when weakened, because he always did. Japp straightened. You saying Bellamy planned this? Poirot nodded slowly. Yes. Bellamy laughed softly. This is absurd. Where is your proof? Poirot smiled sadly. Right here. Poirot reached into his coat and produced a folded paper. A maintenance log, written by Lydia Crane. Lydia gasped. I never gave that to... Poirot raised a hand. No, Mr. Bellamy asked for it. Bellamy stiffened. Poirot read aloud. Dr. Hawthorne requested access to the tower at night. Again. Poirot looked up. You knew his habits. You predicted his movements. You did not need to poison him yourself. You only needed to guide the others. Bellamy's voice rose. Circumstantial nonsense. Poirot stepped closer. You suggested Eleanor give him water. You encouraged Finch to pour the wine. You reassured Lydia when she panicked. Poirot's eyes locked onto Bellamy's. You never touched the poison, but you controlled the hour. Silence pressed heavily. Bellamy's breath quickened. Poirot softened his tone. Why, Monsieur Bellamy? Bellamy's shoulders sagged. Because Hawthorne was dangerous, he whispered. He was exposing things best left buried. Donations, medical trials, people I protected. Poirot nodded. So you sacrificed him? Bellamy laughed bitterly. I didn't mean for it to end like this. Poirot's eyes hardened. But you ensured it did. Japp stepped forward. That's enough. You're under arrest. Bellamy did not resist. As he was led away, the room seemed to exhale. Poirot closed his eyes briefly. The hand behind the hour, he murmured, has been revealed. But as Poirot knew well, even when the mastermind is found, the final truth is never simple. Chapter 6. The confession that came too easily. Confessions, Poirot often reflected, were the most unreliable form of truth. They arrived too quickly, too cleanly, wrapped in relief and resignation. Real guilt resisted. It fought, it denied, and when a man confessed without struggle, Poirot's little grey cells stirred with suspicion. Councillor Thomas Bellamy sat in the small interview room at the back of the assembly hall, his wrists resting calmly on the table, his posture dignified even in disgrace. A constable stood nearby, watchful but relaxed. Bellamy looked almost relieved. Inspector Japp closed the door behind them and exhaled. Well, Poirot, you called it. He confessed. Poirot did not sit. He remained standing, eyes fixed on Bellamy's face. Confessed to what, precisely? Poirot asked quietly. Bellamy lifted his head. To orchestrating the events that led to Edwin Hawthorne's death, Poirot nodded. Yes, but not to killing him. Bellamy's brow furrowed. Is that not the same thing? Poirot smiled faintly. Sometimes, but not always. Japp frowned. He admits motive, manipulation, access. What more do you want note of? Poirot leaned forward slightly. Detail, Inspector. Always detail. Poirot turned back to Bellamy. Tell me, monsieur, when did you decide Dr. Hawthorne must die? Bellamy hesitated. When he threatened to expose our arrangements. Poirot's eyes sharpened. And how did you poison him? Bellamy blinked. I did not poison him directly. Poirot nodded. Exactly. Japp sighed. Poirot. Poirot raised a hand. Patience. Poirot pulled a chair and finally sat opposite Bellamy. Let us go slowly. You say you planned this. Yes. You say you knew Eleanor Pike would weaken him. Yes. You say you knew Lydia Crane would panic. Yes. Poirot folded his hands. And yet you cannot tell me the name of the poison. Bellamy stiffened. I am not a chemist, he said sharply. Poirot smiled gently. But masterminds always know the tools they use. Poirot continued softly. You did not ask Eleanor what she gave him. You did not ask how much. You did not ask how long it would take. Bellamy's jaw tightened. Poirot pressed on. And yet you were confident he would die beneath the clock tower. Bellamy exhaled. I trusted the process. Poirot shook his head slowly. No, you trusted someone. Silence settled heavily. Poirot turned toward Japp. Inspector, where is Dr. Hawthorne's medical ledger? Japp blinked. In evidence. Poirot nodded. It records something interesting. Poirot opened the folder he carried and slid a page across the table. Irregular prescriptions, small experimental compounds, ordered repeatedly, but never by Mr. Bellamy. Bellamy's eyes flickered. Poirot leaned in. They were ordered by someone else. Bellamy's voice rose. You're suggesting another culprit? Poirot smiled sadly. I am suggesting the truth. Poirot stood again, pacing slowly. You are a politician, monsieur. You manipulate people, but poison requires precision. Poirot stopped behind Bellamy. And you are not precise. Bellamy clenched his fists. Then why confess? Poirot answered calmly. Because someone convinced you it was the only honorable option. Japp's eyes widened. You think someone pushed him into confessing? Poirot nodded. Oui, a final act of manipulation. The door opened softly. Eleanor Pike stood in the doorway, pale but composed. Inspector, she said, I wish to make a statement. Poirot watched Bellamy closely. Bellamy did not look surprised. Poirot's little grey cells hummed. Eleanor sat, hands folded. I gave Dr. Hawthorne water at the assembly hall. I added a compound, mild, intended to calm, not to kill. Poirot nodded. You already admitted this. She swallowed. But I did not know it would interact with what he had already consumed. Poirot tilted his head. Already consumed? Eleanor hesitated. Yes. Japp leaned forward sharply. Consumed where? Eleanor looked down. In his office, earlier that evening. Poirot closed his eyes briefly. Poirot's voice was quiet but firm. Who gave him that first dose? Eleanor shook her head. I don't know. Poirot turned to Bellamy. You see, monsieur, this is where your confession fails. Bellamy's face drained of color. Poirot continued. The poisoning began before dinner, before counsel, before Eleanor, before Lydia. Japp cursed under his breath. So Bellamy didn't start it. Poirot nodded. He merely guided it. Poirot turned toward the door. Inspector, bring me Miss Lydia Crane. Moments later, Lydia entered, trembling. Poirot spoke gently. Lydia, did Dr. Hawthorne visit his office before dinner? Yes, she whispered. He stopped by the clinic. Poirot nodded. And who was there? Lydia hesitated, then looked up. Dr. Samuel Reed. The room froze. Japp stared. Reed? Hawthorne's partner? Poirot's eyes sharpened. Yes, his junior partner. Eleanor gasped softly. Bellamy stared at the table. Poirot felt the case tilt. Dr. Samuel Reed. Quiet, diligent, overlooked. A man with full medical access. A man who benefited from Hawthorne's death without scandal. Poirot straightened. "Inspector," he said calmly, "the confession came too easily because the real killer wanted it that way." Japp's voice was low. "You think Reed poisoned him first?" Poirot nodded. "A slow compound, activated later. The others merely completed the pattern." Poirot turned back to Bellamy. "You believed you were protecting the town. In truth, you were protecting the murderer." Bellamy's shoulders slumped. "He said Hawthorne was unstable, dangerous." Poirot sighed softly. "Murderers often say such things." Poirot looked toward the clock tower window. Outside, the frozen hands still read 3:17. "The hour," Poirot murmured, "was chosen by the one who knew medicine, not politics." The real killer had finally stepped out of the shadows, and now Poirot knew the pressure would force him to act. Chapter 7. The doctor who benefited, Dr. Samuel Reed, did not look like a murderer. That, Poirot reflected, was precisely the problem. The clinic stood at the quieter edge of Blackwood, its brick exterior modest, its windows scrubbed clean, its brass nameplate polished with quiet pride. This was where illnesses were treated, children reassured, and lives prolonged. It was also where Edwin Hawthorne had spent much of his final evening. Poirot stepped inside slowly, breathing in the familiar scent of antiseptic and old paper. Inspector Japp followed, his expression hard. "Reed's been Hawthorne's junior partner for 6 years, Japp said. "Clean record, respected, no scandals." Poirot nodded. "The most dangerous men rarely have scandals, Inspector." They were shown into Reed's office, a smaller, neater version of Hawthorne's former room. Medical journals lined the shelves. Instruments were arranged with surgical precision. Everything suggested discipline. Dr. Samuel Reed stood as they entered, offering a polite, almost deferential smile. "Monsieur Poirot, Inspector, I expected you." Poirot inclined his head. "Ah, then you have been anticipating us." Reed's smile flickered. "Given the circumstances, it seemed inevitable." Poirot took a seat without invitation. "Doctor, tell me, when did you last see Dr. Hawthorne alive?" Reed clasped his hands. "Yesterday evening he stopped by the clinic before the council dinner." "At what time?" Poirot asked. "Just before 8, Reed replied smoothly. Poirot nodded. "And his condition?" "He seemed tired," Reed said. "Agitated." Poirot's eyes sharpened. "Agitated how?" Reed hesitated. "He spoke of investigations, of corruption." Poirot smiled faintly. "And did he accuse you?" Reed's jaw tightened. "No." Poirot leaned forward. "But he suspected you." Silence stretched. Poirot continued gently. "You worked under him, learned from him, but he never trusted you fully, did he?" Reed exhaled. "He was controlling." Poirot nodded. "And recently he discovered something." Japp stepped in. "Irregular medical orders, experimental compounds." Reed stiffened. "Those were theoretical." Poirot raised a finger. "No, they were practical, used in small doses, carefully recorded." Poirot placed a folder on the desk. "Your handwriting." Reed stared at it. Poirot's voice remained calm. "You administered the first dose in this very room." Reed shook his head. "I gave him medicine for anxiety." Poirot nodded. "Yes, something that weakened his respiratory system, something subtle." Poirot rose and walked around the room, his eyes catching on a locked cabinet. "What is inside?" Poirot asked. Reed hesitated. "Controlled substances." Poirot smiled thinly. "The key, please." Reed's hand trembled as he handed it over. Inside were vials, neatly labeled, carefully stored. Poirot examined them without touching. "This compound," Poirot said, pointing, "reacts to exertion, stress, cold air." Japp's jaw tightened. "The tower stairs," Poirot nodded. "The climb finished the work." Reed's composure cracked. "I did not intend." Poirot raised a hand. "Intent is irrelevant to outcome." Poirot turned sharply. "You knew Hawthorne would go to the tower. You knew Lydia Crane's devotion. You knew Eleanor Pike's loyalty." Reed's voice rose. "Bellamy orchestrated." Poirot cut him off. "Bellamy was encouraged." Poirot stepped closer. "You planted ideas. You whispered fears. You suggested actions." Poirot's eyes locked onto Reed's. "You let others dirty their hands while you stayed clean." Reed's shoulders sagged. "He was going to ruin everything." Poirot softened his tone. Everything, or you. Reed's breath hitched. I built that practice. He treated me like a subordinate. Poirot nodded. So you replaced him. Japp slammed a hand on the desk. You killed him. Reed shook his head violently. No, I started it, but I didn't know Eleanor would add more, or Lydia would move the body. Poirot sighed softly. That is the danger of manipulation, Doctor. It grows. Poirot turned away, pacing slowly. You did not need to be at the tower. You only needed to know the time. Poirot stopped. Why 3:17? Reed froze. Poirot smiled sadly. Because that is when Hawthorne's heart condition made him most vulnerable. A detail only a doctor would know. Japp swore quietly, cold-blooded. Poirot folded his hands. One question remains, Doctor. Reed looked up, eyes wild. Why did you not simply let Bellamy take the blame? Poirot asked. Reed laughed bitterly. Because confessions invite scrutiny. You would never stop. Poirot nodded. Correct. Poirot stepped closer. And now? What will you do? Reed slumped into his chair, defeated. Nothing. Poirot shook his head. Non, you will make a mistake. As if summoned by Poirot's words, a constable knocked sharply and entered. Inspector, we found something at the tower. They returned quickly to the clock tower's interior. On the maintenance landing, beneath a loose stone, lay a small leather case, medical, unmistakable. Inside, gloves, a syringe, and a handwritten note. Poirot read it silently. A just dosage if cold worsens. Poirot closed his eyes. That was the final proof. Japp turned to Reed. You're finished. Reed did not resist as he was taken away. His gaze lingered once more on the clock tower. I only wanted time, he whispered. Poirot watched him go. Time, Poirot said softly, belongs to no one. As the tower loomed above them, Poirot knew the case was nearly complete. Only one thing remained, to bring every thread together and let the truth chime for all to hear. Chapter 8, When Time Speaks. The Blackwood Assembly Hall filled slowly, the way a confession fills a room, reluctantly, with hesitation, and under the weight of inevitability. Chairs were arranged in careful rows, facing the tall windows that overlooked the town square. Beyond the glass, the clock tower stood motionless, its frozen hands still marking 3:17, stubborn and accusing. Word had spread quickly that Hercule Poirot had asked for everyone involved in the investigation to be present. In Blackwood, that meant nearly everyone who mattered. Inspector Japp stood near the entrance, arms crossed, watching faces as they entered. Harold Finch arrived first, pale and exhausted. Eleanor Pike followed, composed but brittle. Lydia Crane slipped into a seat near the back, eyes lowered. Councillor Bellamy was brought in under guard, resigned and silent. And finally, Dr. Samuel Reed entered, between two constables, his calm demeanor frayed at the edges. Poirot waited until the murmurs subsided. Then he spoke. Mesdames et messieurs, Poirot began softly, time has ruled this town for generations. Tonight it will tell the truth. He turned slightly, gesturing toward the windows. You all know the Blackwood Clocktower as a symbol of order, but symbols can be misused. Tonight one man believed he could own time. Poirot's eyes moved deliberately across the room. This case has confused many because it was not a single act, but a sequence, a chain, each link forged by a different hand. He raised one finger. First, the weakening. Poirot turned toward Eleanor Pike. You gave Dr. Hawthorne water at the assembly hall. You added a compound intended to calm him. Eleanor swallowed and nodded. Yes, Poirot continued gently. You did not intend to kill. You intended silence. He raised a second finger. Second, the panic. Poirot turned to Lydia Crane. You offered him water at the tower. When he collapsed, you froze the clock and moved the body. Lydia's shoulders trembled. I was afraid, Poirot nodded. Fear is powerful and predictable. Poirot raised a third finger. Third, the misdirection. He turned toward Harold Finch. You poured the wine. You argued. You were angry. Finch nodded weakly. Yes, Poirot smiled faintly. Anger makes a convenient mask. Poirot stepped forward now, voice steady. All of you played a role, but none of you planned a death. Poirot paused. And yet, Dr. Hawthorne died. Silence thickened. Poirot turned slowly until he faced Dr. Samuel Reed. Because the plan did not begin at dinner, Poirot said quietly. It began in the clinic. Reed lifted his chin. You've already accused me. Poirot shook his head. No, I am about to explain you. Poirot walked toward the center of the room. Dr. Reed administered the first dose earlier that evening, a compound designed to weaken the respiratory system. Subtle, measured. Poirot's eyes sharpened. He knew Hawthorne's heart condition. He knew the effects of cold, exertion, and stress. Poirot gestured toward the clock tower. And he knew Hawthorne's habits, that when troubled, he climbed the tower, alone. Reed's composure cracked. You can't prove— Poirot raised a hand. The proof is not in isolation, it is in timing. Poirot addressed the room. Dr. Hawthorne did not die at 3:17 by chance. That hour was chosen because it was the point of maximum vulnerability. Poirot turned back to Reed. You counted on the climb, on the cold, on the exertion. Poirot's voice hardened. And you counted on others to do the rest. Reed's breath quickened. Poirot continued. You whispered to Bellamy that Hawthorne was dangerous. You encouraged Eleanor's calming measures. You trusted Lydia's devotion to the tower to cause panic. Poirot leaned in. You never needed to be present. Inspector Japp stepped forward. Dr. Reed, you manipulated everyone. Reed shook his head weakly. I only wanted him to stop. Poirot shook his head. You wanted him replaced. Poirot's eyes softened, but only briefly. When Bellamy confessed too easily, I knew the truth. Murderers resist, pawns confess. Poirot gestured to Bellamy. You believed you were protecting Blackwood. In truth, you protected a murderer. Bellamy bowed his head. Poirot straightened and addressed the room once more. Time exposes patterns, and patterns expose truth. Poirot turned toward the window. Outside, constables were already preparing to restart the clock mechanism. When the clock begins to move again, Poirot said softly, Blackwood will move forward, but it must do so with honesty. He turned back to Reed. Dr. Samuel Reed, did you poison Dr. Hawthorne with intent to kill? Reed closed his eyes. Yes. The word fell like a dropped instrument. Gasps rippled through the hall. Poirot nodded. Merci. Inspector Japp signaled the constables. Reed was taken firmly by the arms. As Reed was led away, he spoke once, quietly. He treated me like an assistant, Poirot replied calmly. And you treated him like an experiment. The hall emptied slowly after that. People did not speak much. Truth rarely invited conversation. As Poirot and Japp stood alone near the door, Japp exhaled deeply. You caught him without raising your voice. Poirot smiled faintly. Truth does not shout, Inspector. It waits. Outside, a loud click echoed. The clock tower shuddered. The hands began to move. 3:18. Poirot watched carefully. Time, he said softly, has resumed, but there was still one thing left to do. The final words, the final understanding, the final curtain. Chapter 9, The Last Chime. The sound was small, but in Blackwood it echoed louder than any confession. Tick, the great clock tower, silent for days, had begun to move again. The hands crept forward with reluctant dignity, as if the tower itself were uncertain whether it deserved to resume its authority. The square below lay quiet. In the pale light of early morning, shop shutters remained closed. Footsteps were few. Blackwood was awake but subdued. Hercule Poirot stood alone beneath the tower, his gloved hands folded neatly behind his back, his gaze fixed upward. 3:18, he murmured. At last. Inspector Japp joined him, lighting a cigarette he never quite finished. You did it again, Poirot. Poirot smiled faintly. Non, Inspector. I merely listened. They stood in silence for a moment, the steady ticking filling the space where tension once lived. It wasn't a simple murder, Japp said quietly. Half the town touched it in some way. Poirot nodded. That is what made it dangerous. When responsibility is shared, guilt hides. They began to walk slowly across the square. The cobblestones, once witnesses to panic and secrecy, now felt ordinary again, almost forgiving. Dr. Reed is in custody, Japp continued. Bellamy's charges will be revised. Eleanor Pike will face disciplinary action. Lydia Crane, well, the court will be lenient. Poirot sighed softly. Leniency is not forgiveness, Inspector, but it allows people to live with themselves. They reached the steps of the clock tower. Poirot paused, resting a hand against the cold stone. This tower, Poirot said, did not kill Dr. Hawthorne, but it was chosen. Japp frowned. Why here? Poirot looked up again. Because places hold meaning, and meaning amplifies fear. Poirot turned away from the tower and toward the assembly hall, where a single light still burned inside. Inside the hall, Eleanor Pike sat alone at the long table, papers spread before her, her posture rigid. She looked up as Poirot entered. Monsieur Poirot, she said quietly, I was hoping to see you. Poirot inclined his head. You are troubled, Eleanor laughed bitterly. I thought I was doing the right thing, protecting the town, protecting myself. Poirot pulled out a chair and sat opposite her. Good intentions, he said gently, are the most common accomplices to evil. She lowered her eyes. Do you believe I am a bad person? Poirot considered this carefully. I believe you are a person who made a choice, and then another, and then allowed someone else to decide the ending. Eleanor nodded slowly. That feels accurate. Poirot stood. Then learn from it. That is all justice truly asks. Outside, Lydia Crane waited near the tower's entrance, her coat pulled tight around her shoulders. She flinched when Poirot approached. I moved the body, she said quickly. I'll never forgive myself. Poirot looked at her kindly. You loved the tower more than you trusted yourself, she swallowed. Will they take it from me, my job? Poirot shook his head. No, but you will hear it differently now, she frowned. Hear what? Poirot smiled faintly. The chime. Lydia looked up as the clock struck the hour, clear, steady, alive. Tears filled her eyes. Poirot continued down the square. Harold Finch stood near his office door, staring at the ground. I was a coward, Finch said without looking up. Poirot stopped. Courage is not the absence of fear, monsieur. It is the refusal to let fear decide. Finch nodded once. I won't forget that. As the sun rose higher, Blackwood began to stir in earnest. Doors opened, voices returned, life resumed, not unchanged, but informed. Poirot returned to the small inn where his bag awaited him. Hastings was not there this time. This case had required solitude. He packed carefully, as always. Before leaving, Poirot took one last walk through the square. He stopped at the center, turning slowly, committing the scene to memory, the tower, the hall, the faces he would not soon forget. Inspector Japp appeared beside him once more. You'll be off then? Yes, Poirot replied. There is nothing more for me here. Japp hesitated. You ever get tired of this? Poirot smiled gently. Of truth? Never. Of tragedy? Always. Japp nodded. You know, Blackwood will remember this for generations. Poirot adjusted his moustache. They will remember the clock stopping. They will remember the death. Poirot paused, then added softly, but perhaps they will also remember that time can begin again. A carriage waited at the edge of the square. As Poirot stepped into it, the clock tower chimed once more, confident now, unbroken. Poirot closed his eyes briefly. Murder, he murmured, believes it can escape time. The carriage began to move. But time, Poirot said, opening his eyes, is very patient. And with that, Hercule Poirot left Blackwood behind, his little grey cells satisfied, his conscience clear, and the truth at last set free. Chapter 10. When the clock keeps time, Blackwood did not wake all at once. The morning after the truth was spoken arrived gently without drama. There were no crowds in the square, no raised voices, no urgency. Only the soft rhythm of routine returning, slowly, cautiously, like a town testing whether it was safe to breathe again. The Blackwood Clocktower chimed the hour, not loudly, not defiantly, but steadily. For the first time since Dr. Edwin Hawthorne's death, the sound did not feel accusatory. It felt ordinary. Hercule Poirot stood at the window of his room at the small inn overlooking the square. He had risen early, as was his habit after a case concluded. Sleep always came lightly to him once truth had been extracted. It was then that reflection took over. Below, Lydia Crane crossed the square carrying a toolbox, her movements careful, respectful. She paused briefly beneath the tower, resting her hand against the stone before unlocking the service door. Poirot watched her with interest. "She will never hear that clock the same way again," he murmured. A knock sounded at the door. Inspector Japp entered, removing his hat. His face looked older than it had days ago. Cases did that to men who stayed behind when Poirot moved on. "Thought I'd catch you before you left," Japp said. Poirot smiled politely. "You have caught me at the correct moment, Inspector. Timing matters," Japp snorted softly. "I've learned that." They stood in companionable silence for a moment, listening to the faint ticking drifting through the window. "Reed's confession has been formally recorded," Japp said. He stopped trying to justify it. Poirot nodded. "When excuses fail, silence often follows." "And Bellamy?" Japp continued. "He will live with his guilt," Poirot replied. "That is sometimes the heavier sentence." Japp leaned against the wall. "Funny thing is, half the town feels responsible." Poirot turned from the window. "That is because they are," Japp frowned. "You don't think that's dangerous?" Poirot shook his head. "On the contrary, collective awareness is how communities heal. Blackwood believed order came from the clock. Now they understand it must come from themselves." They walked together down the stairs and out into the square. The town looked unchanged, shops reopening, deliveries arriving, but something intangible had shifted. Conversations paused when Poirot passed, not from fear, but respect. At the assembly hall, Eleanor Pike stood overseeing clerks reorganizing documents. She noticed Poirot immediately. "Monsieur Poirot," she said quietly, "I wanted to thank you, though I doubt I deserve it." Poirot inclined his head. "Truth does not concern itself with deserving, mademoiselle." She hesitated. "Will Blackwood forgive me?" Poirot considered this carefully. "Forgiveness is not granted by towns. It is earned through time." She nodded, accepting this. Near the clock tower steps, Harold Finch waited awkwardly, hat in hand. "I've resigned," Finch said abruptly. "From the council." Poirot raised an eyebrow. "That is a significant change," Finch swallowed. "I spent years avoiding responsibility. I won't do that again." Poirot smiled faintly. "Then Dr. Hawthorne's death may yet prevent others." Finch looked up, surprised. "You think so?" Poirot nodded. "That is how meaning redeems tragedy." The hour struck again. Lydia Crane emerged from the tower interior, wiping her hands on a cloth. She froze when she saw Poirot. "I checked the mechanism," she said quickly. "Twice. It's stable." Poirot smiled kindly. "I never doubted your devotion, only your fear." Her eyes shimmered. "I thought the tower would judge me forever." Poirot looked up at the clock. Face. "Stone does not judge. People do." She nodded, visibly lighter. Poirot took one last slow walk around the square, committing the sounds to memory, the footsteps, the voices, the ticking that now blended into normal life. At the edge of town, a carriage waited. Inspector Japp accompanied Poirot as far as the cobblestones allowed. "You know," Japp said, "most detectives would have focused on the poison, or the body, or the confession." Poirot smiled. "And missed the hour." Japp shook his head. "You really believe time tells the truth?" Poirot stepped into the carriage, then paused. "No, Inspector," he said gently. "Time only reveals who respected it, and who tried to cheat it." The driver cracked the reins. As the carriage rolled away, the Blackwood Clocktower chimed once more, unconcerned, impartial, eternal. Poirot closed his eyes. Another town, another lie, corrected. Another moment returned to its proper place, and behind him, Blackwood continued. Not perfect, not innocent, but awake. The clock kept time, and life at last moved forward. Final CTA, True End of Story, English. Thank you for listening until the very last chime. If this mystery stayed with you, share your thoughts below. Which character do you believe carried the greatest guilt, and why? Your comments, theories, and reflections are always welcome. If you enjoy long-form Hercule Poirot mysteries, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more timeless detective stories. Until our next case, remember, time reveals everything.